Elemental versus ecological theories of perception. If neurons at each stage of the sensory system pathways respond to increasingly complex stimuli, it makes sense to think about sensory detection as taking information apart and perception as putting it back together. This idea was discussed by early psychologists such as Wilhelm Wundt, 1982 to 1920, but developed most thoroughly by his student Edward Titchener, 1867 to 1927, who promoted a school of thought called structuralism. The basic idea behind structuralism is that perceptions are created by combining or adding up the elements of sensations. In terms of vision, the process occurs as follows. Visual stimuli, e.g., shape, color, and size, are coded in different groups of neurons that convey this information in parallel to higher brain regions. When neural signals arrive at a new brain site, sometimes called a relay station, the information is recombined and transmitted to other parts of the brain. In this way, the elements of visual input are the building blocks for the recognition and interpretation of complex visual scenes. The main evidence for this elemental theory of perception is that the time to process two different features of a stimulus, e.g., color and shape, is the sum of the time it takes to process each individually. Similarly, the probability of correctly identifying individual features when stimuli are flashed briefly on a screen is perfectly predicted by the combined probabilities of reporting each on their own. These effects, observed in both humans and pigeons, would not be expected if perception was synergistic. Theories that explain perception in terms of feature binding, or simply putting elements together, are modern versions of structuralism. One of the most prominent is the feature integration theory, Treisman, 1988, which posits that elements of sensory input, e.g., shape, color, and motion for visual objects, are coded at the initial stages of processing and then combined at higher levels to produce perceptual wholes. These and other elemental theories of perception are sometimes called bottom-up theories. Elemental theories of perception appear to explain many experimental findings, but seem at odds with human experience, in which the sensory world is perceived as a whole. This criticism was formalized into alternative theories by the Gestalt psychologists, a group of European scientists, e.g. Wertheimer, who proposed that individuals perceive sensory information in its entirety, e.g. a visual scene, and then divide it into elements only if further processing is required. In North America, James J. Gibson, 1904 to 1979, voiced a general disillusionment with elemental theories by pointing out that perception is not a passive documentation of features in the sensory world, but an active process of gathering ecologically relevant information. The information that an animal or human acquires, therefore, will vary depending on how it is moving through the environment. In studying this process, Gibson used the term optic flow to describe the movement of elements in a visual scene relative to the observer. 1979. Optic flow is one of the most important sources of information to an animal because it provides feedback on how its own behavior is altering sensory input. Gibson extended this idea further, noting that the primary function of perception is to allow animals to act upon and to interact with their surroundings. The principles of optic flow are an important component to many interactive computer games. Figure 2.15. Figure 2.15. Video games that simulate rapid motion, such as fast driving, rely on optic flow to create the illusion of movement. Gibson's ideas on optic flow and other ecologically relevant processes are closely tied to evolutionary theory. If optic flow is a critical component of visual perception, sensory and motor systems must have evolved together. Otherwise, the rate of information flow generated by movement through the environment may not match the rate at which sensory receptors can encode the moving information. This tight link between sensory and motor systems is illustrated in day and night active insects. The retinae of the night active insects integrate visual information more slowly than their day active relatives. Bipedal locomotion evolved in humans, so the rate at which you walk should be ideally suited for gathering visual information about your environment. Although it may seem that you miss many things, consider how much more you remember about a new city if you walk through it, compared to if you are driving or riding on a high-speed train. Gibson's focus on perception as an interactive process helped to create a subdiscipline of psychology called ecological psychology. According to this position, behavior and cognition can only be understood in the environmental context in which it takes place. Sensory perception, therefore, should be studied under real-world conditions or in laboratory experiments that simulate the natural environment. Despite the widespread influence of Gibson's theories, many researchers continue to study sensory systems in the lab, and many contemporary theories explain sensory processing as the integration of elements or features. These two different approaches to studying perception, elemental versus ecological, should be considered as complementary rather than contradictory. Each position explains the process from a different perspective. There is no doubt that sensory input is segregated into elements in the central nervous system, or that separate groups of neurons respond to different elements of the sensory environment. At the same time, at least some perception is accomplished via a computational process that depends on an animal's interaction with its natural environment. These two different types of perceptual processing, elemental and ecologically relevant, probably occur simultaneously in parallel pathways. Stimulus filtering. Both elemental and ecological theories must account for stimulus filtering, the process of separating and extracting meaningful, i.e. biologically relevant, information from the abundance and diversity of sensory cues in the environment. Stimulus filtering occurs first at the level of the sensory receptors, which respond to a particular range of physical energy within a modality. For example, humans hear only a small spectrum of sound waves, but are acutely sensitive to those which transmit auditory signals from conspecifics, i.e. speech. On a broader level, stimulus filtering is accomplished by sign stimuli, the essential features of a stimulus which are necessary to elicit a specific behavioral response. Responses to sign stimuli are typically species-typical behaviors that occur in a fixed order, although these may be modified with experience. Examples include courting, nest building, and defensive responses. Although these behaviors may be quite complex, they are often controlled by a small number of simple features, i.e. sign stimuli. Tinbergen, 1951, documented one of the first descriptions of responses to sign stimuli in herring gull, Larus smithsonianus, chicks that peck a parent's bill. The pecking, which is directed to a red dot on the bill, causes the adult to regurgitate food for the youngster. By presenting artificial stimuli of various shapes and colors, e.g. cut-out cardboard, painted sticks, etc., Tinbergen determined that the chicks were attending exclusively to the shape of the bill and the red dot. The pecking response, which is critical for the young bird's survival, therefore is elicited by a small but essential feature of the parent. Other well-known examples of sign stimuli include the red belly of stickleback fish that elicits aggressive responses in other males, female pheromones that elicit ritual courting dances in male birds, and egg-shaped objects that elicit egg-rolling responses in nesting geese. Because they reliably produce species-specific behaviors that promote survival and reproduction, sign stimuli are sometimes called releasers. Sign stimuli are an efficient means to interpret the sensory world because they provide meaningful information with minimal sensory input. An elegant demonstration of this principle comes from a classic study by Sheff et al. 1962. In an experimental setup like the one shown in Figure 2.16, researchers set subjects, rhesus monkeys, Macaca mulata, on one side of an opaque screen and a light on the other. Placing a small circle in front of the light cast a shadow on the screen. Moving the circle away from the screen caused the shadow to expand and the subjects to flee in terror. Moving the circle toward the screen, or simply changing the screen illumination, was ineffective. A range of animals from crabs to frogs to chicks to humans showed the same escape response, suggesting that these very different species were all interpreting a growing shadow in the same way. According to ch2 and his colleagues, the rapid and symmetrical expansion of a visual stimulus is always perceived as an approaching object, a phenomenon they called looming. Even kittens and chicks that were reared in the dark, with no experience of approaching objects hitting them, were quick to avoid potential impact from the looming stimulus. This is a hardwired response, no learning required. Indeed, the escape response is so strong that it is almost impossible to suppress, a fact that is exploited in video games, flight simulators, and IMAX theaters. Most people cannot avoid ducking when an asteroid from outer space suddenly fills the screen. Figure 2.16. Experimental setup to test looming. ch2 et al., 1962. A monkey sat facing one side of an opaque screen. A light behind a circular disc on the other side cast a shadow on the screen. Moving the disc caused the shadow on the screen to expand or contract. Okay, so in this diagram, you have a monkey on one side, then you have the opaque screen, and then you can see on the screen the shadow from the disc, and then on the other side, you can see a circular disc and a light source shining on it. And they're all like parallel to each other on the same plane. An updated version of the looming experiments used computer-simulated visual images to examine how the brain coordinates this rapid escape from approaching objects. Wang and Frost, 1992. It was already known that neurons in the visual area of a pigeon brain fire when a looming stimulus approaches. Wang and Frost varied the size and speed of these moving images on a computer screen to demonstrate that a small population of visual neurons compute exactly when an object will collide with the observer. The calculation in these time-to-collision neurons is amazingly precise, taking into account how far away the object is, how big it is, and how fast it is moving. So two objects may be the same distance away, but if one is moving faster than the other, it will set the neurons firing at an earlier time point. Less than 100 milliseconds after the neurons begin to fire, heart rate increases and muscle activity peaks. This suggested to Wang and Frost that activity in the time-to-collision neurons is a signal for the animal to escape. In essence, these neurons are sending a very specific message to the rest of the body: get moving now. The stimuli in both the looming and time-to-collision experiments were very simplistic. In the case of the former, just a growing shadow on a screen. But this information was enough to elicit consistent and reliable responses across animals. Organisms do not need to know much about a stimulus, what it is or where it comes from, to know that they should get out of the way if it is heading right toward them. Like other sign stimuli, the looming and time-to-collision stimuli allow animals to make cost-effective decisions with limited information and no time to waste. These are sometimes described as simple rules of thumb for perception. It makes more sense to interpret a glimpse of moving fur in the bush as a predator than to wait until the entire animal appears to judge whether or not it is dangerous. Errors that arise from these perceptual rules of thumb are usually rare and often inconsequential, i.e., erring on the side of caution when detecting a predator. Thus, there is no evolutionary pressure for them to disappear. Researcher profile: Dr. Barry Frost. Barry Frost's scientific investigations started very early in life. Growing up in New Zealand, he was an avid observer of the wildlife that surrounded him, often asking himself how and why animals behaved as they did. He took these questions to his formal education, where he completed a BA and MA at the University of Canterbury, New Zealand, a PhD at Dalhousie University in Canada, and a postdoctoral fellowship at the University of California, Berkeley. He was appointed to the Department of Psychology at Queen's University, Kingston, Canada, in 1970, where he has continued to conduct world-class research on a range of topics that cover neuroethology, animal navigation, auditory and visual neuroscience, as well as virtual reality in humans. Frost's primary research interest is sensory processing. He has studied visual, auditory, somatosensory, and even olfactory function in a variety of animals, ranging from butterflies to humans. One of his primary interests is how the brain distinguishes between movement caused by the head's own motion and the organism's actual movement through the environment. Pigeons are an ideal model to study this phenomenon because they engage in constant head bobbing as they walk. Frost was able to train pigeons to walk on a tiny treadmill and then vary their visual environment by moving films at different speeds around the birds. Based on this work, he and his team concluded that head bobbing served an important function, allowing pigeons to take ongoing snapshots of the world around them. Frost has also looked at the role of this head bobbing and other pigeon movements in reproduction by developing a virtual pigeon that elicits courting behavior in conspecifics. His work is cited in many introductory textbooks, and his theories have led to practical applications, such as an artificial ear for the profoundly deaf, which allows users to feel sound through their skin. Frost's fascination with visual and auditory processing led him to investigate navigational skills of both birds and butterflies. How do these animals find their way partway around the world, sometimes traveling on their own for the first time? His work in this area has led him on many international excursions, clambering around on cliffs at night in the outer reaches of the South Pacific to track birds by equipping them with tiny radio transmitters that communicate their location to passing satellites. His younger colleagues call him the Indiana Jones of neuroethology. Barry Frost typifies all of the qualities that make a world-class scientist. He is inquisitive, conscientious, and collaborative. He uses a range of techniques from behavioral observation to neurophysiological recordings, allowing him to address both proximate and ultimate explanations of behavior. In his words, "The technique is irrelevant, it is the research question that matters." Despite his retirement more than 10 years ago, Frost can still be seen racing madly through the halls of Queen's University, often with his butterfly net in hand. Attention. Sensory detection and processing filters, organizes, and codes sensory signals in the environment, thereby reducing the amount of information that reaches higher brain regions. Even so, most organisms are exposed to a vast array of sensory input across modalities, e.g., visual, auditory, tactile, etc. If there was no way to ignore irrelevant input, the sensory overload could create a constant state of scatterbrained confusion. Attention solves this problem. The mental process that selects which information will be processed further allows individuals to focus on particular stimuli or events. Attention is difficult to quantify, so it did not fit easily into models of stimulus-response learning promoted by behavioral psychologists. Nonetheless, many scientists in the early 20th century, in the early 1900s, discussed attentional mechanisms and how these may influence other cognitive processes such as memory. This increased with the rise of cognitive psychology and the realization that internal mental processes could be used to explain behavior. Even experimental psychologists studying animal behavior began to incorporate attentional mechanisms into SR theories, stimulus response theories, noting that learning is affected by the amount of attention animals devote to a stimulus. Selective attention. One of the first things researchers noted is that attention is not a unitary construct. This is apparent in the many descriptions of attention: pay attention, short attention span, and grabbing someone's attention all refer to different processes. To deal with this complexity, researchers have categorized and defined different types of attention. One of the easiest to conceptualize is selective attention, the ability to attend to a limited range of sensory information while actively inhibiting competing input. Selective attention is sometimes called the cocktail party phenomenon, in reference to the ability to converse with a small group of people while blocking out other conversations in the vicinity. In the visual system, selective attention is accomplished by moving the eyes to the point of interest. It can be measured in the lab using computerized eye tracking as shown in Figure 2.18. Figure 2.18. Eye tracking software can provide a measure of selective attention by indicating which part of a visual image subjects spend the most time looking at. Eye tracking experiments reveal an important aspect of selective attention in humans. When looking at another person's face, most people focus on the eyes, particularly when the facial expression is emotional. In general, females spend more time than males gazing at the eyes and are better at identifying emotions in other people. In contrast, many autistic individuals have difficulty attributing emotional states to others, and those that do show reduced scanning of the eyes. Selective attention, allowing humans to focus on one feature, eyes, of a larger stimulus, face, is adaptive in that the ability to recognize an angry aggressor, a fearful opponent, or a friendly mate is critical for social species, including humans.